The forces unleashed by the French Revolution in Europe continued to simmer throughout most of the first half of the century. You saw efforts by the conservatives to re-establish authority in places like the Austrian Empire and Prussia and Russia. France attempted to return to its Bourbon monarchy, and they attempted to re-establish a very conservative order with the Catholic Church at the heart of it, and things like that. But the populations of these various countries were more interested in the rights and the liberties that had been promised during the French Revolution. And so what we see is by the middle of the century, these energies are boiling over, and you've got populations who are now ready to take matters into their own hands. Therefore, revolutions and nation building during the third quarter of the 19th century. The revolutions that occurred in 1848 broke out almost spontaneously and disconnectedly throughout Europe. You see revolutionary efforts and energies taking place in most of the big urban areas, most of the big cities, especially capital cities. Paris is going to see uprisings. Vienna is going to see uprisings. There are the beginnings of uprisings in Berlin. Those get put down pretty hard. The Russians are able to quell most of theirs, but it's mostly through fairly brutal repression. The French uprisings are interesting. After an attempt to re-establish the Bourbon monarchy and to reassert conservative control, economics seem to disrupt the entire process, like they did for the original French Revolution. And the French find themselves in a position where prices are extremely high. The life for peasants, for the population in Paris, is very poor, and the population revolts. The monarchy is overthrown, and France holds open elections, sets up another republic. The winner of this election is actually a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, Louis Bonaparte. Louis wins the presidency of this French Republic, but very quickly moves to consolidate power. The French people seem to be fairly comfortable with the Napoleon name, and they allow him to do a lot of things that, well, quite frankly, they had revolted against the Bourbons for doing. Louis Napoleon holds another election fairly quickly, and then after winning a large majority, simply has the Constitution changed and names himself Emperor. He takes the title Emperor Napoleon III. This is, one, paying tribute to Napoleon Bonaparte, the first Napoleon emperor, but also his uncrowned son. But Napoleon III, as Louis Napoleon as was, undertakes a great deal of reformation. Now that he's in control of Paris, he's going to de-revolutionize the city. And in many ways, this means deconstructing it. His mayor of Paris, Baron Haussmann, oversees the destruction of medieval Paris. Much of the congested downtown, which had allowed for barricades to go up, which had allowed for a high level of population concentration, pollution, poverty, all of that's wiped out. And in a very expensive, but essentially very successful remodeling, Paris is rebuilt into the modern city of lights that we know today. Broad boulevards, easy to move troops up and down if you need to, hard to put barricades across. Uniform facades, a very controlled, a very modern-looking empire. Now, Napoleon also puts in some long overdue reforms. He's going to reform the economy, he's going to encourage manufacturing, he's going to make France into a much more capitalistic nation. All of these things ultimately are very successful. In fact, Louis Napoleon is successful in most everything he does, except when he imagines himself to be his uncle Napoleon Bonaparte's equal in military affairs, and we'll get there. Austria, the home of Clemens von Metternich, also sees its uprisings as Austrians get tired of the kind of repression that the conservative government had instituted. Austria also suffers from nationalism as the various ethnic groups within the Austro-Hungarian Empire start pulling for their own individual autonomy, their own political organizations. The German elements of the Austrian Empire begin to pull as well. In the end, the government winds up being overwhelmed. Metternich resigns, the Austrian government is imperiled, and they have to call upon the Russians for help. The Russian Tsar sends in thousands of troops, and they pretty mercilessly put down the revolutions. The Austrian uprising not nearly as successful as the French ultimately in gaining these big changes to the government. But Austria kind of owes the Russians one now, and the Russians are really the last member of the Holy Alliance who's able to emphasize in a strong way this anti-revolutionary component. In the German states, what you see is an effort to assert German nationalism. A Congress that's held in the city of Frankfurt is an effort to unify those 30-odd German states that had been declared at the Congress of Vienna. When they decide that they will organize themselves under a Prussian leadership and they offer the crown of a unified Germany to the King of Prussia, he turns it down. He calls it a crown in the gutter and that he wants nothing to do with it. It's not that Prussia wouldn't like to run Germany, but they want to run it on their own terms, not be given by some coalition that feels empowered. German universities, German students, professors are part of the group that rise up in 1848 to demand change. They are pretty brutally repressed. Troops occupy the campuses, professors who teach the wrong thing are done away with, newspapers that print the wrong thing are done away with, and a very conservative sort of lockdown takes place in the German states. England doesn't have the revolutions of 1848. There are energies in that direction, but England's already taken some steps. The reforms that they took in the 1830s has helped to offset some of the upset of the British system. The British economy is doing better than their continental rivals, albeit still challenged. The Industrial Revolution does not move forward flawlessly. Efforts by the British citizenry to bring forward petitions, to bring forward requests to the government, usually go unpassed, unvalidated by the government, although efforts like Chartism let the British government know that there's an awful lot of energy out there for change, and while they don't give the British citizenry everything that they want, they do continue that process of democratizing. They open the vote up to more of the sort of nouveau wealthy that the Industrial Revolution has created. More of the responsible working class, more of the people who have sort of earned some wealth and some say in government. Now, the last one on here, the Crimean War. This is not really a result of the revolutions of 1848. Instead, this is some of that instability that I talked about in terms of the Congress of Vienna and the balance of powers. The weak man of Europe, as they call it, the Ottoman Empire, is collapsing. And as it collapses, it presents an opportunity to its next door neighbors, the Austrian Empire and the Russian Empire. And both of them are very interested in grabbing territory from the Ottomans as they collapse. And they try to do it in the name of a European ethnicity. They're going to take these European properties away from the Ottomans, who are seen as Asiatic or Oriental and other. And when the Russians move troops into what will become Romania, the territories of Wallachia, Moldavia, it brings about a coalition resistance. The Turks initially try to stop the Russians when the Russians issue a stinging defeat to the Ottoman Navy. The British and the French join together to prop up the Ottoman Empire. They are joined by a newcomer power of Piedmont Savoy, who will show up more in the second half of this lecture. But the result is a 3-year war, the Crimean War, which is bloody, brutal, localized, and largely reestablishes the situation as it existed before the fighting started. We have some sort of notable battles, the siege of Sebastopol, the charge of the Light Brigade, some of these sort of romantic things. And probably the most notable personality to come out is Florence Nightingale, who teaches the medical profession to wash its hands. Kind of a joke. Florence Nightingale and her more or less professional nursing staff makes a big difference for the results of the war. Your textbook will tell you that in the Crimean War, it was probably the case that more soldiers lost their lives as a result of disease than of battle. In reality, that's true. Combat will not be the primary killer in Western armies until World War I. It's not just true of Crimea, though. It's all wars. It's more dangerous to be in the army than it is to be in the fighting in some cases. The disease that ravaged these armies often took a much heavier toll in terms of total losses. So, the revolutions of 1848 stir up Europe, bring about some hard feelings, threaten the balance of power, the concert of Europe, but ultimately things return to about the situation they were before. The real shakeup in the situation is coming just down the road, and that's nationalism in the non-multinational powers, Germany and Italy.